We all have that one thing. There's one thing in our lives that will drive us to great lengths to protect. Whether that be our own comfort and security, whether that be our children, our spouse, our marriage, we have one thing, most often, that we are built to worship by our lives. You watch children, there's one thing that will guard more than anything else. Whether that be a relationship, whether that be an item, whether that be a sense, they will guard. You walk into a child's home and you bring children with you, you will see what that child cares most about, because they will often have it tucked away, or they will have it on display, just depending on the situation and the nature of the child. We all have that one thing that we would do anything to protect, do anything to guard, do anything to elevate, or even to show off. We want this one thing. We worship this one thing, if we can be really honest. We don't often think of it that way, but that's what we do. We have this one thing. We become Christians, and this one thing becomes a side thing, or it's supposed to. Because Christ now is supposed to be our one thing. The one thing we worship with our lives, the one thing that we elevate, the one thing that we show off, the one thing that we even, to a degree, we guard for ourselves. We guard from external things. Christ is to be that one thing, but too often in our lives, that old one thing kind of slides in. It sneaks in under the guise of Christ, and we're going to protect this thing because we love Christ and because He's been good, and this thing is most likely good for us. It's most likely not something horrible that we would want to hide or is shameful for us, but it's something that is okay. Perhaps morally, or okay, perhaps societally. We're gonna hold on to this one thing, but now we get to bring it under the guise of Christ. So now we worship our children because we love Christ. We worship our jobs because we love Christ. We worship whatever that one thing is because we love Christ. In the cultural climate in which we live, this is acceptable, especially in church. And should I say, even in church. It's acceptable to have good things that your life is about, so long as you can put it under Christ. Right? Christ is your one priority, but your life is lived for this other thing. But because you give glory to Christ, or you give back to Christ, or at least you attend church, you're okay to pursue this one thing. And again, that's often different for many of us, even though we might fall into a similar category. Now, one thing is not always going to be the same, although you feel most comfortable with people who have a similar thing, or a similar type thing, as you do. We search out churches that have similar things that they're going to pursue. Which is why churches inevitably, over time, tend to all look the same. We lose diversity because we want people who have the same kind of things as we do that they're pursuing. We all have this one thing. And it's really, really easy for us to forget that there really is only and ever one thing for us as believers in Christ. And that one thing is not our children, it's not financial security, it's not anything else other than Christ and the glory of His name. Genesis chapter 22. We come to an incredibly divisive, complex, difficult passage of Scripture. It's one that people have read or heard about, and immediately their initial response is to turn away from a God who would do or ask such a thing. Genesis chapter 22, starting in verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose, and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes, and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together, and Isaac said to his father Abraham, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. He said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked. Behold, behind him was a ram, caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide. As it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord. Because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. If there would be anything in Abraham's life that would be his one thing at this point in his life, it would be Isaac. Abraham has waited 100 years for this son. And that even beyond hope, because he thought that both he and Sarah were not going to be able to have a child together. And yet as we've walked with Abram on this journey, at least 25 years of knowing that Isaac would be coming at some point, as we've walked with him, we've seen his faith remain true. Not that he has been perfect, but his faith remained true to the promises that God has made. And then, as we talked about last week, we've seen God fulfill those promises, not just in the birth of Isaac, but also in the carrying of Ishmael, and the protection that God continues to provide for Abraham and for his family. If Abraham at this point is to have a one thing, it is going to be Isaac, the son of promise, the son that he's been waiting for, the son that he and Sarah prayed for and asked God for and pleaded for. And yet here we have God doing, to our sensible minds, an outrageous thing. God testing Abraham and asking for the slaughter of Isaac. This son of promise. What it says here, his only son. Now, was it the only child that he had born? No. We have Ishmael too, who is now down in Egypt, doing whatever Ishmael's doing. But God calls him his only son. The one thing for Abraham. We see God command Abram to take Isaac and to sacrifice him to God, to give him to God. And what does Abraham do? Does he wrestle? Does he battle? Does he take time to make sure? Does he, like Gideon, start laying out fleeces? According to the text, God commands, and Abram wakes up early the next morning to obey. Is this not baffling faith to us? This does not seem contrary even to the law and the goodness of God, that God would even ask this of Abraham. Isn't there something that rises up within our American Christian spirit to say this is not fair, this is not okay, this is against God's character? And even there are times, and folks, there are books and people out there who would be glad to create another God for us than what God reveals of himself here. They want to do other things with the language, and they want to do other things that maybe Abraham misunderstood. They want to do all kinds of things to try to make this chapter of the Bible go away. And boy, wouldn't we love to too. When we love to make a God who demands our all go away. When we in our flesh love to have a God who allowed us to keep our little pet sins. The ones that we've called good for a long time. The ones that indeed could be labeled as good. Our children, our marriages, our work and performance. When we love to be able to have God and these other things that we can pursue with our lives, and as long as we continue to say, well, we're doing this for the glory of God, make those things okay. I often wonder if there was any moment in the heart of Abraham where he was like, really? Is this really what we're going to do with my son? My only son. The text doesn't give us that. It doesn't give us his wrestlings. It doesn't give us his crying out like it does in other places with other characters and other people. And even though in the text this is kind of butted up against where God has fulfilled all of these promises, this is most likely maybe a decade removed from that covenant with Abimelech, where he's safe now from people attacking him. Where Isaac was born and the fulfillment of all these promises, we're probably a little bit far removed from those, as Isaac is now able to carry a burden up a mountain. Plenty of time for Abram to kind of forget that God is one who keeps his promises, and yet we don't have any wrestling here. It doesn't even say that he stayed up all night trying to figure out if this was really the voice of God or not. And then the Bible helps us again in understanding Abraham and his working through this in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 17, says this: by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And then the scriptures here in verse 19 gives us a glimpse as to Abraham's processing. He considered that God was able. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive. Abraham took a moment to consider before he went to sleep that night, to consider that this God who had made this promise did not require just one lifetime. Indeed, did not even require a living Isaac to fulfill his promise. Now, I want us to recall just the period of history that we've read through the book of Genesis and Job. There is no evidence in the scriptures other than the creation account to suggest that God is so all-powerful as to be able to take a slaughtered human being and raise him from the dead. There's nothing. There is no such miracle as yet recorded, done by God, to give evidence to Abraham's faith that God could, if he slaughters his son, raise him up. Now, Abraham may have had an understanding of the God who had spoken all things into existence. Perhaps. The story of creation. God has certainly showed himself to be able to do miraculous things. But not like this. Life for people in this period of history was it. Now, there might have been some machinations of people having created a type of afterlife by their gods, but those were all pagan. The unfolding of God's plan for his people after this life is done was not yet fulfilled, had not been revealed. This is a different level of faith than we had yet experienced. Indeed, that required something different of Abraham. God asked of him the one thing. And what does Abram do? Does he wrestle? Does he seek for clarification? No, he considers this God is able. He's able. No matter what the circumstances tell me, to even fulfill his promise. When it looks like, to me, like there's no way he could fulfill his promise. What a testing. Like, I think of tests and I get anxious about tests that I've had to take in my life, right? Exams. For Spanish. English or history. To get into this or get into that. And I've questioned whether it was worth it to even go. I don't know about how your life was, but I don't know if you ever just kind of skipped a test, right? It's like, I'm out. Don't even want to deal with it. This would have been one that, I think if it had been another character in the Bible, another person in historical God, we might have seen him trying to flee. Like, we're going to get away from this God who's asking me to sacrifice my son. Right? Like a Jonah. Like Jonah was just asked to go to a city and tell them that they needed to repent, not kill his own son. God tests Abraham's faith. And Abraham's response is that God is able to keep his promise, to bring a people a blessing through Isaac, even if he was sacrificed. So there are a couple of things that we have to do in our minds and hearts as we approach this. First of all, we have to remember who God is. God is not doing this because God doesn't know Abraham's faith. When we read that God is testing, God is not trying to gather information. Much like as we talked about with Job, when God tests his people, God is not putting his people at risk. God is not putting his promises at risk. That even if they are to fail, that he somehow lost them, or they somehow now don't have his love. When God tests his people, it is for one reason. It is out of his love. Out of his grace. It is as a loving, caring Father. God tests Abraham out of this, fully knowing what is going to happen. Let us not forget this. Let us not for even a moment wrestle with the idea that God is somehow being cruel to Abraham. Or that he is somehow inviting Abraham into sin in this test. He's not. Does not indicate in the character of God to tempt us towards sin, to give us even a command to sin. The command to sacrifice Isaac is not a sin on God's behalf. So as we approach this, we have to kind of take a deep breath. Breathe a little bit and remember who God is. Second thing we must do as we approach this text is remember the sufficiency of God and God alone. We must remember, as we approach this text, the sufficiency of God and God alone. There is not anything that God would ever take from us that we truly needed. Nothing in this life outside of himself. There is nothing he could take from us. He could take all of my riches, which is not much. He could take my home. He could take my family. He could take my health. And I still have all that I need. This is the lesson of Job. Job, as he's wrestling with, is God really there? Is God really near? At the end, Job repents of all of his righteousness and says, I thought I knew you, but now that I do, I don't need anything else. Brothers and sisters, that is a hard lesson to learn. And I am not at all trying to suggest that this idea of God's sufficiency is an easy one for us because we have one thing. We have plenty that we're willing to give to God. We have plenty of a couple of hours a week that we're willing to give to God. Sometimes we have money that we're willing to give to God. We're willing to be okay with God if He takes a car that we know is breaking down anyway. We're even often okay if God changes our location. Moves us from one city to another, from one state to another, from one position to another, whatever. He can even take a job from us, and we still may be okay. But we all have that one thing that we really don't want Him to take. That one thing we really don't want to give up. And where God may not come to us and do what He's done with Abram, which I'm really, really thankful for, there are a lot of times that He will, in His love and in His grace, press on us in that area. And we call that testing. Where God will faithfully reveal to us what else we worship beside Him. When God pressed on Isaac, we're not given a lot of evidence that he flinched. But rather was willing to say, God, you're able to fulfill your promise. You're able to even give me back my son. Why? Because at this point in Abram's life, in the decades now that he's been walking and serving and seeing God fulfill His promises, Abraham's faith is secure in God and in God alone. There's nothing else that he has left in this life. He has Him. If God has made the promise that it is going to be through Isaac, then even the sacrifice of Isaac is not going to deter him. But I think we have a glimpse of something else also. If we go back to the Genesis account. I do not think that Abraham fully expected that God would require of him such a sacrifice. Because I don't think that Abraham is necessarily lying to Isaac when Isaac says, listen, we've got the wood and you've got the stuff to start the fire, but we don't have the sacrifice. And what is Abraham's reply? He says, listen, the Lord is going to provide for Himself. The Lord is going to provide the lamb. So, I think this gives us a sign that Abraham was not fully resigned that God was going to go through with this. But of course, Hebrews tells us that even if he does, he still had hope in God. He still had faith in God. It's not that Abraham is either lying or commenting that God better do this, right? Because we do that sometimes with God. I think Abraham still held out the hope that in this test, God is still going to show Himself faithful. God is still going to do something unique. God is going to do what God is going to do, but it is going to be in fulfillment of His promise. Whether that be bringing Isaac back to life after the sacrifice, or as He tells Isaac, because I don't know how you tell your son as you're walking up that you're going to slaughter him when you get up there, but I think Abraham is anticipating God is going to provide this for Himself. God is going to show that He is enough to provide for Himself the worship we give in our lives. There's much in this story that we don't know the full context of what all goes on in Abram's heart or what all goes on in Isaac's heart or all of these things. What we do know is that God commanded the one thing that we would think Abraham would want to keep. And Abraham's faith told him, you can trust God. Scriptures teach us that this faith is not from Abraham. This faith is a gift from God to His people. If you are Christ, you have been gifted this type of faith, the faith of Abraham. You have access to such faith. The Scriptures and even Abraham's life are going to show that there are times that we decide not to believe this God, but rather believe what we see. Which is why the promise is going to come in this. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. We're always going to have, in the moments of testing, these choices, the same choice laid before Abraham. Will we trust God? Even if He calls away the one thing. Or will we trust ourselves? Brothers and sisters, Abraham stands as an example of faith to us. Next week we will talk more about how this story should affect and apply to us. Because there's much more that we can glean from it. But for this morning, what we are to get from this passage, from this text, from this Word of God to us even now, is that there is faith available to you. In whatever test you are in now. God, through the work of His Son, Jesus Christ, has given us by His grace, as He has saved us, the faith to walk in obedience to Him. As we look back at our lives, we've seen moments of these testings. Maybe not as large as sacrificing a child, which I'm thankful for. I'm thankful that God hasn't given me that one. But where God has brought into our lives a test to show whether our faith is going to be in Him and what He has called us to as we seek obedience to Him, or whether we will lean on our own understandings, or how we can put it this way is we will trust our feelings to dictate our direction. Like, I want to obey God here, but I'm afraid of what that's going to mean for my family. I want to obey God here, but I'm afraid of how people are going to look at me. I want to obey God here, but I don't want to live without this. Brothers and sisters, you are invited this morning into a faith that allows rest for God's people as we trust Him who is able. If you're in a test right now with your finances, you are able to rest at peace tonight because God is able to provide for your every need. He is able. If you're wrestling with relational strife, whether that be somebody at work, or somebody in your life, a family member, a spouse, if you're wrestling with that, you can go to bed tonight at peace because God is able to do work in that in that other person that you could never do, or no counseling could ever do. God is able. This morning, if you're wrestling with the future of your family or your children or someone you love that you are walking with, and you get so afraid for them about what's going to happen, or you're looking at the state of our nation and wondering what's going to be left for our children as they grow up in a culture such as we are in. Brothers and sisters, our God is faithful and He is able to secure our children in the future. To hold them. To save them. He is able. You can rest tonight. Faith. This God that we serve is able. Abraham rested and he awoke with a full confidence of obedience to God, no matter what he would ask. And he was willing, even though he anticipated the land, was willing to fulfill obedience in the sacrifice of his only son. But God, in His ability to work all things for the glory of His name, did not require such a thing. Just as He had planned, just as He knew He would do upon asking it of Abraham. And therefore God gives, as a picture of what Christ would be for us, God gives the sacrifice. Not one that Abraham earned, one that God provided for Himself. Brothers and sisters, we can rest, and this account given to us in the book of Genesis should give us a reason to be able to rest in God. It should not make us fearful of a God who would ask too much of us, but rather give us peace that whatever God may ask of us, He does not leave us, but is near to us and will do above and beyond what we would hope in that testimony.